Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon what time zone you're in. I'm Christine King. I'm the director for the Gateway for Accelerated Innovation in Nuclear, and I'm very excited to be here with you today. And I hope I am not the first to wish you Happy Earth Week. And I hope you're planning for a big, lots of events to join in on Earth Day this Thursday. And with that, I wanted to talk a little bit about why we are doing a webinar series called Shaping Our Carbon-Free Future. For those of you joining us that are from the nuclear industry, whether you're working with the existing fleet or whether you're working on one of our new technologies, interest in nuclear obviously is increasing, and which is a very positive thing. We have newcomers coming to nuclear, and as an industry, we have spent a significant amount of our time somewhat siloed and working with just ourselves. So what we want to do is help look at nuclear in context of a clean energy conversation. Look at the policies associated with clean energy, and understand where those policies are supportive to nuclear or potentially where they might need some additional either adjustment or support. In addition, it's also about thinking about our technologies beyond electricity. So Colin is here and will talk to us about his work that was published last year, and also some developments since then, potentially spurred by his work on energizing America and the policies necessary to meet a carbon-free future. Don James from Microsoft is going to share a perspective of what it looks like to lead from a corporate perspective on carbon-free targets. And actually, I find what's most interesting about Microsoft is the bold carbon negative promise that they are trying to achieve. And Kirsty and Eric are going to help us go all the way to the end. Let's go to 2050 and let's reimagine and look at what energy could be. And with that, having created this common platform, if you didn't get a chance to participate in our first webinar series, we started with, so what is the magnitude of the problem? Do the math. Let's look at this. Have you considered what scenario planning looks like? If you're not familiar with scenario planning, I would suggest getting educated in that realm, because we're going to be doing a lot of that in the next many decades as we roll out different technologies and as we're pursuing a carbon-free future. It's going to be necessary to always come back and look at those different scenarios. So with that, let's go to the next slide. We'll cover some basic logistics. Your camera is turned off and you are muted, and it's still, COVID times in 21. That doesn't mean we don't want to hear from you. Please use the question feature in the control panel to ask questions. They'll come into us. We will do each presentation, and we'll take questions for each presenter after the presentation. Everyone will be available, so if you think of something for Colin towards the end of the webinar, slip it, put it in there, and we'll bring him back on screen. For those of you that use a VPN, I know for my team, sometimes the VPN does cause us some audio and video difficulties with some lag. So we suggest disconnecting from that if your company allows you to. If your company does not allow that, I am not telling you to break rules. That's not what we're saying here. Presentations will be available on the GAIN website, and we are recording this meeting, and by joining, you're giving your consent to be recorded. Let's go to the next slide. This is our structure for today. A nice, reasonable pace for us to have a good conversation and hear from our presenters. We've got about 15 to 20 minutes of material for each presenter, and then plenty of time on the back end to ask questions. So with that, we'll start with Colin. Next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry. Nope, not yet, Colin. Go back. One of the challenges I think all of us are having in COVID times is meeting new people. And certainly that's something we've done in the past by going to new conferences and meeting people over a nice hot cup of coffee. So we are trying to allow for us to bring energy professionals together, not being siloed by our particular technologies, and we have created a LinkedIn group. We'll post the link in the chat so for all to see, and I hope that you will join us there. We will be posting follow-on material, articles of interest to keep this conversation going. LinkedIn as a platform, hopefully you guys are already on there just for professional networking anyway, but I think it gives you an opportunity to meet new people outside of your particular interest and have a diverse perspective on your work going forward. Okay, now next slide, let's start with Colin. So for the other presenters, if you want to turn your cameras off and take a little bit of a break, I'll come back to you guys. So Colin is a senior policy analyst with the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. You guys are capable and can read his bio there. I think what's most interesting is the way that Colin not only looks at the policy aspect of things, but really looking at this in an integrated fashion, considering what it's going to take to get these technologies out into the field as well. And with that very short introduction, I'm going to turn it over to Colin.
Okay, thanks, Christine. Can you hear me?
I can hear you just great. Let's go to the next slide.
Great, so thanks for that introduction. I'm going to talk today about Energizing America, which is a volume that I co-authored last year with researchers from the Columbia Center on Global Energy Policy and ITIF. And it calls for a national energy innovation mission and provides a roadmap with guidance and recommendations for Congress and the new administration. And I'm going to begin with some big picture thoughts about innovation and then zoom in on nuclear energy. I should caveat this with I'm not a nuclear expert, but hopefully we can make this work. Next slide. So a bipartisan consensus has emerged in recent years around the need for increased federal investment in clean energy innovation. DOE's applied energy RD&D programs have increased. This slide is actually outdated. It's increased by more than 40% over the last 4 years. And we should note that 2 of those budgets in fiscal year 2018 and 2019 were passed with complete Republican control of Congress, and then FY20 and FY21 with divided control. So again, there's broad bipartisan recognition of the need for greater support for innovation. And in December, Congress passed the Energy Act of 2020, which was the first major reauthorization of the Department of Energy in more than a decade. And then most recently, in his fiscal year 2022 budget request, President Biden proposed quadrupling government-wide clean energy research, development, and demonstration over the next 4 years. Next slide. So Energizing America is divided into 2 parts. The first part makes the case for that the federal government should dramatically increase funding for clean energy innovation. The second half provides a set of strategic principles for how to design an RD&D portfolio, along with more targeted recommendations. But to the first point, we need to invest in energy innovation at a level that is commensurate with the magnitude of climate change and the urgency of accelerating the clean energy transition. And it's clear that we could be investing much more than we currently do. So the United States currently invests about $9 billion per year in clean energy RD&D across all agencies. And that's about 0.04% of GDP. But this compares to around 38 billion annually for health research, more than 60 billion annually for defense research. And this is even less than historical investment in energy. So the Department of Energy was created in the late 1970s during a time of rising energy prices, the Arab oil embargo. And energy innovation was really seen as a matter of national security. So in its very first budget in 1978, Congress invested $10.5 billion in today's money in energy innovation at the Department of Energy, about 0.14% of GDP. And had that amount simply stayed constant as a fraction of the economy, then today we would be investing $32 billion in clean energy. So these examples show that we as a nation have the ability to marshal our innovation resources on a much larger scale than we currently do. Next slide. Now we know that expanding public investment in clean energy RD&D can hasten decarbonization. So this figure shows US energy carbon dioxide emissions under 3 different technology scenarios. And this is modeling that was conducted for the Quadrennial Energy Review in 2017. Under a baseline scenario in blue, emissions remain roughly constant. And in the scenario in which the Department of Energy meets its technology goals, which are generally contingent on constant funding into the future adjusted for inflation, then US carbon emissions fall 23% by 2040. And if DOE's budget were doubled, allowing it to reach more ambitious technology targets, then emissions could decline by an additional 15%. So it's clear that RD&D is an important part of the decarbonization toolkit, but it's also clear that we need much greater ambition. Also that RD&D is only part of the story. We need additional complementary policies that expand markets for clean energy. Next slide. So greater investment can also help improve the competitiveness of US industries. Global annual investment in energy was nearly $2 trillion in 2019, and the share going to clean energy is increasing rapidly. And investment in clean energy actually increased in 2020, even despite the economic contraction caused by COVID. And many countries are devoting some of their COVID stimulus packages to new energy industries, and the US risks missing out. We currently trail 13 other countries in the share of GDP devoted to energy innovation, and China invests nearly twice as much. But of course, there's also a lot of opportunity here. The US still has one of the best innovation systems in the world and is well positioned to lead, particularly in CCUS and advanced nuclear and some of these other advanced energy technologies. Next slide. So as part of our research, we developed the first government-wide estimate of clean energy RD&D since the Office of Management and Budget. In 2016, in the lead up to Mission Innovation, they produced a report. We tried to model that. We find that other agencies, including the Department of Defense and NASA, annually invest around $2 billion in clean energy research. But I'm going to focus mostly on the Department of Energy and particularly the Office of Nuclear Energy. So go ahead, next slide. So that was the first part of Energizing America. The second part really fleshes out the details of a national energy innovation mission, and it does so along these 3 dimensions. So we first identify 10 technology pillars, which each addressing a critical decarbonization challenge. And I imagine if we all sat down and came up with our own, we would come up with approximately the same set: clean electricity generation, advanced transportation. We also developed a set of strategic principles to help policymakers balance the RD&D portfolio across different dimensions. And then finally, we identify immediate actions for Congress and the administration. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but I do want to highlight just a couple of the principles for RD&D portfolio design. So go ahead and advance to the next slide. So the first principle is that we need to match the funding portfolio to critical decarbonization needs. On the left is US greenhouse gas emissions by economic sector. Transportation and electricity generation are the largest sources of emissions, followed by industry, buildings, and agriculture. And on the right is the Department of Energy's portfolio broken down by sector. And you see a big mismatch. Nearly half of funding is devoted to either clean electricity generation or grid modernization. About a quarter is devoted to energy science and cross-cutting technologies. And then transportation, buildings, and industry account for disproportionately small shares. So we recommend that as federal funding ramps up, increases should target these under-resourced pillars for the fastest ramps. Now, as far as what this means for nuclear innovation, I think it's really important that the nuclear industry look to provide energy services beyond electricity. And that's why I'm particularly excited to hear Kirsty Gogan's talk later today about nuclear hydrogen. Hydrogen, of course, is an incredibly versatile energy carrier that can address hard to electrify transportation, as well as many industrial sectors. Go ahead to the next slide. So the second principle is that we should support all stages of the innovation pipeline, particularly the demonstration stage. So right now, DOE's portfolio is heavily weighted towards early stage research and development, and the government devotes less than 5% to demonstration projects. That's mostly in advanced nuclear. But we find that new technologies typically need to be scaled up and they need to be demonstrated and validated in a real world setting before they can attract significant private investment. The good news is that policymakers have been listening. So the Energy Act of 2020 actually directs DOE to conduct demonstration projects in advanced nuclear, but also in a full range of other technologies, in enhanced geothermal systems, in energy storage, and in carbon capture. And in particular, it authorizes the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program. Now, before moving on, I'll say we think that many of these principles are evergreen and are still relevant, but a lot of the specific recommendations in Energizing America have actually been superseded by recent events. So much is happening in federal energy and climate policy. So go to the next slide. So Energizing America came out in September of last year. Since then, the Energy Act passed in December. ITIF and some other think tanks and the Edison Electric Institute joined the Carbon-Free Technology Initiative, which is a more targeted set of recommendations aimed at developing 24/7 carbon-free electricity generation. We came out with a set of recommendations in March. And then most recently, the administration released its fiscal year 2022 budget. Now this is in 2 steps. So the first step, they released the so-called skinny budget in April. It consisted of 2 pages for all of the Department of Energy. So it included some top line numbers and the administration's priorities, but it's really lacking in some of the details. The full congressional budget justification documents are typically around 3,000 pages for DOE. We're told that'll come out possibly late May, early June. Go ahead to the next slide. So going through each of these, first, the Energy Act did make some pretty significant changes to DOE's nuclear energy programs. So this figure shows funding levels for 3 main R&D sub-programs: reactor concepts in blue, fuel cycle R&D in orange, and nuclear energy enabling technologies in the darker shade of gray. And you see in FY20, the Senate Appropriations Committee was frustrated with DOE not yet demonstrating an advanced reactor. So they created a new advanced reactor demonstration program. That's the light gray. And then in fiscal year 21, the versatile test reactor got its own line in appropriations reports. I believe it had been previously funded out of the reactor concepts program. But the Energy Act of 2020 really reprioritized the office around these 2 large projects, the Advanced Reactor Demo Program and the Versatile Test Reactor, and provides increasing authorization levels through 2025. And it remains to be seen whether congressional appropriators will provide funding at these recommended levels. Now, I should point out these levels are less than we recommended in Energizing America. And I think we used estimates, higher estimates of the cost of the Versatile Test Reactor and also funding for the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program that were based on original funding levels in the House Nuclear Energy R&D Act. But I assume the funding levels were negotiated during the passage of the Energy Act. But still, we're pleased to see this greater emphasis on technology scale up for the VTR being a user facility. And so I think we're at least pleased with the ambition of the Energy Act. Go ahead to the next slide. I'm also excited about the Carbon-Free Technology Initiative. This is a joint venture between ITIF, many other energy and climate think tanks, Bipartisan Policy Center, Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, and so on, but also the Edison Electric Institute, the Nuclear Energy Institute. This is really aimed at developing policies to advance firm, zero carbon electricity that is dispatchable and available 24/7. Many utilities already have 100% decarbonization goals, and recognize that existing technologies can take them much of the way towards those goals, but getting all the way to 100% clean will require new carbon-free 24/7 technologies and require them to be affordable. So this initiative is honed in on 6 key technology areas: advanced wind and solar, super hot rock deep geothermal, zero carbon fuels such as hydrogen, advanced nuclear energy, carbon capture, use and storage, and long duration energy storage and demand efficiency. Next slide. Now, again, this initiative is only focusing on the power sector, unlike Energizing America, but it is in a way more comprehensive because it addresses the entire innovation ecosystem. So not just research and development, not just demonstration, but it also makes targeted recommendations for deployment and also commercial ecosystem issues. So for each of the technology areas, it has recommendations across each of these 4 dimensions. Go to the next slide. So here's a snapshot of some of the policy recommendations for nuclear energy. I won't go through all of these, but I'll just point out a couple. In the R&D space, launch a nuclear affordability initiative. This is one thing that I think DOE has done well in other areas. In 2011, they launched the Sunshot Initiative to decrease the cost of solar photovoltaic to 6 cents a kilowatt hour by 2020. They met that goal 3 years early. They now have a new goal of 2 cents a kilowatt hour by 2030. Onshore wind, offshore wind, geothermal, all of these other technologies, DOE has set targets for. The Office of Nuclear Energy doesn't have a target, or at least it hasn't historically set one. In fact, the only one that Office of Nuclear Energy has comes from the Energy Act of 2020, where Congress directed the Office of Nuclear Energy to set a target of, I believe, 6 cents a kilowatt hour. So I'd really like to see more focus from the Department of Energy on setting and achieving these cost targets and really focusing on barriers to commercialization for nuclear specifically. And then just another example, again, where they go beyond what we talk about in Energizing America, is they talk about federal procurement using virtual power purchase agreements of 10 to 30 years for advanced reactors, perhaps tax credits, supporting HALEU, and then in commercialization, providing funding for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to develop advanced reactor licensing pathways. So all of these recommendations are on the Carbon-Free Technology Initiative website, which I think was on an earlier slide. And then go ahead and go to the next slide. So I'll stop there. I'll just say for further reading, you can go to Energizing America. If you want a hard copy, you can purchase a book on Amazon, but we actually make it free as a PDF. And then the ITIF Energy Budget Report is an annual report that we release every year on the Department of Energy's RD&D budget. It will be out in May of this year, addressing the fiscal year 2022 budget. But if you go to the website, you can still see the report and see how we spend money on energy technologies in previous budgets. And I'll just stop there and take your questions.
Okay, thanks, Colin. So I guess one thing I'd like to hear a little bit more about, you guys have specifically used RD and D. Okay, so a lot of times you hear about R&D, Um, you hear, but tell me why the emphasis and the importance of demonstration in the success of reaching our carbon goals or carbon. Go ahead.
So this is a particular gap in the U.S. innovation ecosystem, and probably around the world too. We invest a lot in R&D, and there are a number of indicators to track whether those investments are successful. You can look at patent rates or publication rates, energy startups. By a number of indicators, we are really successful, but it's really important to scale up these technologies from the lab setting or the bench scale setting to the scale at which they will actually be used in the real world. And that typically requires larger investments than most DOE R&D programs award. You think RPE, the average award might be $2 or $3 million, but to demonstrate something, it might be in the tens or 20s of millions. And the last time the US actually had a large-scale investment in demonstration projects was in ARA 2009. The American Recovery and Reinvestment Act provided funding for industrial carbon capture projects.
Okay. So one of the things that you didn't cover, and hopefully you're okay with me poking a little bit on this. So you talk about, as one of the strategic principles, the importance of partnering with state and local governments. What specifically does that look like? I mean, is this, in your mind, about the federal government setting a target that the states can follow? Or do you think this is more of creating an enabling framework that allows the states and local governments to be successful?
So there are a range of reasons, but I'll talk about two. One is, of course, that much of the regulatory control over our energy system resides with states, and regulators need to feel comfortable with the new technologies that they're ultimately going to be adopting. So it's important to engage them early on in the process. Another reason is that state innovation systems, that they're smaller, they're more targeted. States do have some budgets for research and development. They're very small outside of California and New York. Because they're very small, and they tend to be more tightly focused on commercialization and economic development. And in fact, I wouldn't even say what they call research and development looks very similar to what the federal government calls research and development. It's more about supporting incubators, supporting startups, taking these technologies to and turning them into a commercial product. So in that sense, what I've been saying is that in the federal innovation ecosystem, we've got this gap in scaling up and commercializing technologies. Those state energy offices, state PUCs, are more connected with economic development, and looking from that perspective, they're a natural partner to actually help support these entrepreneurial businesses.
Okay, all right, sounds good. So going back to the Energy Act of 2020, so I do share your enthusiasm for seeing some line items in the budget dedicated to the advanced reactor demonstrations and VTR. But I'll personally, in the way that you've shown this, it looks a little out of balance when we look at our fuel cycle R&D and the reactor concept R&D going forward. Now, I noticed the Energizing America curve is much larger than that.
Mm-hmm.
Is that to provide some balance for the R&D programs? And I'm speaking from a gain perspective that, we get up every day to help people come into the labs and use the national assets, have the experts that are available, helping these technologies become real faster, obviously. But we can't do that with dwindling budgets and potentially, the result of that is experts leaving those fields. I don't. So could you talk a little bit about the gap between your curve and what is currently authorized?
Yeah, and GAIN was reauthorized in the Energy Act, but I don't think Congress specified the funding amounts.
No, they didn't.
uh, yeah, no, there were some things that were left out. And that is what we recommended in Energizing America, increasing funding for all of the programs, but just greater increases for the Advanced Reactor Demo Program and VTR. But so that is, you're right, that is part of that gap. So, and that is part of the Energizing America, I mean, excuse me, the Energy Act consequences, as you saw those traditional programs actually get smaller going forward.
Yeah, and personally, I'm a little worried that the momentum that we have gained is by using the facilities within national labs, which allows these companies not to have to build that for themselves. And I'd like to see that continued, but obviously there's some work to be done on the budget. Going to CFTI, that is not an acronym that rolls off the tongue. So, but talk about a little bit in the deployment space. You have the power purchase agreements. Why is that important? Why is that critical, and how has that been used in other industries successfully, and is that why you're recommending it for advanced reactors?
Yeah, so just in general, and this was a gap in Energizing America, but we were aware and cognizant of that gap. But we often think of innovation policies in two camps: the technology push and the market pull. And innovation policy works best when those two sets are both working in tandem. Technology push is like just developing better, cheaper technologies, and it's primarily R&D. But for most of the other energy technologies that are now making their way into markets, there is this complementary market pull. There are tax incentives, there's government procurement. For solar energy, for example, in the 80s, NASA was an important market for satellites, for solar PV technologies, and that enabled the solar industry to get get its feet under itself and begin to invest in R&D to make their products better without worrying about competition in wholesale electricity markets for a couple decades. And so we've seen that that there are just a wide range. This is also another gap in U.S. innovation policy, that we don't really do this well, and we don't do it all together. The Department of Energy does the RD&D, but deployment might come from tax incentives or the General Services Administration and its procurement of electricity.
Okay.
So it was really important, even though there are still going to be different actors, there's still going to be this somewhat balkanized set of actors. It was important for the Carbon-Free Technology Initiative to wrap our heads around the entire process and make this whole suite of recommendations.
Okay. So one of the things that I'm not sure that you were avoiding, but one of the things that always comes up associated with nuclear is waste.
Hmm.
And so when you when you talk about, and waste is a different story associated with advanced reactors. We have the potential for recycle. But when you look at your fuel cycle R&D, is that full circle? Is that, have you guys thought about, I notice there's an emphasis on supporting the HALEU fuel market, but in particular, how is waste handled for nuclear?
So the Carbon-Free Technology Initiative did not make recommendations in that space. I think we just recognize it's a touchy subject, and it's more challenging to get all of these different actors on the same page. I can tell you, I worked on this personally a little bit when I spent a year in Congress working for Senator Feinstein, and she supported the Nuclear Waste Administration Act, which adopted many of the recommendations of the Blue Ribbon Commission, and it was very tough to get that bill to move, and I don't think it got a hearing.
Well, maybe you and I can discuss offline some things that we can do to talk about waste and maybe move forward on you know, what waste looks like in the future, because I do think it will be different from where we are today.
Mm-hmm.
So another question, and I'll make this your last question. So you've been quite generous. So how do we get innovation focused on the deployment model? So how do we not demonstrate outdated and not commercially scalable construction and contracting models? Is there something in either in policy space or in demonstration space that we should be focused on to make sure that we bring that we try to achieve a higher common denominator in actual deployment?
So the good thing about this initiative is that it has so many different organizations with different areas of expertise. This is an area where I'm not sure that I'm the expert. I do think in general, innovation transfers to commercial deployment quickest when you have a partnership of technology users with technology developers. So it's really important to get that engagement from the electric utilities who would be using new nuclear technologies, with public utility commissions who would be adopting this in rate making settings. But as far as I'm not sure I'm qualified to get into more specifics than that.
So let me ask you, what are you most excited about in your work as you look forward to the next few years? Maybe what you're either hoping to achieve or just excited to see progress on.
Well, the Energy Act was a huge accomplishment. Senator Murkowski started working on that in 2015 when she first became chair of Energy and Natural Resources. And that just gives you a sense for how challenging it is to pass legislation. And she finally got it over the hurdle in her last weeks in office. But that's a huge accomplishment, and I hope that that engenders greater work, greater bipartisan work, both in Congress and outside of that. Certainly, even before the Energy Act, we saw Republicans and Democrats coming together around certain technologies, including nuclear, including carbon capture and storage, and also energy storage, are sort of the three technologies I think of that have the most bipartisan support. But I think we're really going to have to watch the appropriations process and see if appropriators provide full funding for everything that was authorized. They also have the power to push back on proposed cuts to programs that could be important or that didn't receive enough attention in the Energy Act. So as you talk about some of the other parts of the nuclear energy budget, those are some areas to look for. But I think also this broader acknowledgement that we can't just do early stage R&D, that we have to do the scale up, that we have to do the commercialization. And there's still ongoing efforts in Congress, in both Senate Energy and Natural Resources and House Science, Space and Technology Committee, to continue to address these issues.
Okay, thank you so much, Colin. I look forward to actually looking at that budget report coming out in May. I know that's a nerdy thing to be excited about, but I am excited about that.
Good.
All
I think
right,
my
thank you so
tagline
much.
is I read thousands of budget documents so you don't have to. That should be my Twitter
Ah,
handle.
yes. Well, they're not for the beach read. That's for sure. All right, if we could go to our next slide and our next presenter. I am very excited to have Don James here from Microsoft. Don's the Director of U.S. Sustainability and Environmental Sciences. The reason I'm excited for us to have someone from the tech sector is one, as a large end user of energy, and also being committed to a carbon negative goal by 2050. I think it's interesting for us to hear how Microsoft is starting to break this down and consider these goals along the way. I will suggest for everyone, if you have not looked, there is a blog available on that Microsoft openly shares how they're doing relative to their carbon negative goals, things that they've learned along the way. And I think that's important coming from our tech sector. They are a large energy consumer, and they're not waiting for others to solve the problem for them, which I think is the most refreshing. And and being a global leader, you have the opportunity, to teach others. So Don specifically is looking at what these coalitions and partnerships look like to create a sustainable journey, and look at this different initiatives, and hopefully, what sharing this within our community allows us to understand what our technologies need to do to be investable for a corporation like Microsoft. Don, it's nice to see you, and I'll turn it over to you.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much for the warm introduction. It's great to be here. Really enjoyed Colin's presentation. I'm definitely going to pick up that PDF and read a little bit more about what he's doing. So go ahead and get started. I'll talk a little bit about myself before I get started. I'm not necessarily your typical Microsoft employee in that I'm a geoscientist. I've spent 25 years in the natural resources industries. I started out my career in geotechnical engineering and moved through environmental consulting. I was a research hydrogeologist at within the Department of Interior. And then I moved into the energy sector and worked in digital transformation and petrotechnical applications. So I've had a different kind of career, and here at Microsoft, I am Director of Sustainability and Environmental Sciences, but I am also an industry expert, and I serve mostly as a subject matter expert to inform how we leverage our IT infrastructure and cloud services in a sustainable way for our customers and partners. So I really do a lot of business strategy and industry expertise, lending my industry expertise so that we really focus on the business challenges and the business outcomes across the different sectors that I cover, not just the technology. Obviously, technology is extremely important as an enabler, especially as a cross-industry enabler. But the way that, and this is me, Don James speaking, the way that I like to see it is really that we focus on the challenges of an organization's sustainability journey, how we look at the different levers or the areas of influence that impact climate factors, climate risk factors that impact the organization inside and outside in various ways. And we look at those challenges and see how technology or digital solutions can enable change or enable transformation. So the way I usually talk about it is business drives technology, not the other way around. So go ahead and get started on the presentation a little bit. On the next slide, the way that we really start describing, go ahead and move slides here. So the way that we really start describing the issue here, right? So from a Microsoft perspective, we're very committed to harnessing the power of technology and utilizing it in service of our mission, which is to empower every person, every organization on the planet to do more. And in this case, do more in building a more sustainable future. So on the next slide, the way that we tend to look at our commitments is really on a planetary scale, right? So we focus on the 4 key environmental systems that that impact climate risk mitigation. So these 4 areas that we're focused on really come from the UN Climate Accords and the SDGs that came about, so that we are in concert with all of the other organizations and entities on the planet that are also following the SDGs. And we agree, right? So we've made some bold commitments around being carbon negative, waste zero, and water positive, all by 2030. We're focused around ecosystems in the stance of biodiversity and understanding really from a biomass accounting standpoint, understanding our land management across the globe, and then really taking accounting and understanding from a species standpoint. Right now, we know that 25% of species are threatened with extinction. We know that we have a serious carbon budget issue if we are to keep the Earth's temperature below the 1.5 degrees is stated in the UN Climate Accords. There's 420 gigatons outstanding in the carbon budget today. On the next slide, one of the ways that we really start looking at how to leverage technology to face some of these environmental challenges. So we take our 4 critical environmental areas where we're focusing our solutions, from carbon, water, waste, and ecosystems. So we have our own goals around these 4 areas, but then we also focus our business strategy around how these 4 areas impact some of our critical areas of business, right? So from a carbon and energy standpoint in particular, we really look at our own emissions. We look at how our own emissions have grown over time, and then also how we can decrease our emissions within our cloud, from our data centers, and then also from a hardware perspective. Now, with water, our company is from a global standpoint, we are not, we don't use a great deal of water from a global perspective, but we also need to be very thoughtful about how we expand into water stressed regions. We are a member of a number of coalitions, and we have a number of solutions that then also face kind of how companies and ourselves can reach this water positive goal. We also look at waste and how waste intersects within these kind of spheres of influence in the way that we look at the different issue areas. So we're very keen on being able to use digital as a enabler for circular economy, you know, as we look at our own products and our own product development and how we end of life them. And then finally, we look around, you know, look at ecosystems and look at where digital technologies can really play a role at improving land use and, like I mentioned, biodiversity and also sustainable agricultural practices. So we're really looking at gaining business insights, and this is something that we've been doing for a very long time, gaining insights and analytics around our own organizational metrics. We've been doing it for years, but then we also look at all the companies that we work with, partners, situations, and we're able to understand and gather analytics on how these solutions work. So we look around at nature-based technology solutions for climate risk mitigation, as well as technology-based solutions, and at where the two can work in conjunction together. So now, as a company, we're really out of the boardroom and into supply chain and into the field. We're leading our initiatives and our business strategy really on these 3 T's of trust, transparency, and transformation to drive behavior around sustainability and environmental stewardship. So this really isn't just about Microsoft and our own journey, but it's about how we are empowering the sustainability journey of all those that we touch. So on the next slide, the way that we go about empowering this journey is, to me, it's quite logical. You know, we look at it across our own company and how we've looked at our own sustainability journey, where it starts, where we're moving to, and how we're getting to the state of really being able to achieve our goals. And we look across nearly 200 companies on sustainability, companies that we've worked with, companies that we're partnering with, and we've discovered that while companies really vary where they are in their sustainability journey, we see that across industries, across sectors, there's a lot of similarities, right? So one of the things that I always talk about, because people ask me a lot, right? So they ask me, where do we start? Where do we begin as an organization on our journey? And you know, not just being from a technology company, but being a scientist, right? Being a geoscientist, all roads lead to data, right? Data is king, right? Data is the new oil, whatever the cliche is. It's true, right? We have to record data, right? We have to understand, either from telemetry, from sensors, understand, you know, our geospatial data, understanding where we fit within the context of the journey, right? So from a measuring, monitoring, and tracking standpoint, it's really important for organizations and ourselves to understand what our footprint is. Next, we have to be able to account for our resource usage, right? As at a company level, at a product level, to be able to report. So some of these are regulatory reporting. Some of these are around understanding our standards and being able to transparently talk about our scope 1 through 3 emissions. But this is also in a way that we report back to ourselves, so that we understand as a company how we're doing, right? So in some cases, like I said, these are regulatory reporting, but also we're looking to drive behavioral change, change around our sphere of influence, but then also change internally. And so one of the things that I kind of talk about when we talk about sustainability and organizational structure and how to drive change. One business strategy that I learned about is really looking inside yourself, right? And it is cliche, but it's true, right? Change happens from within before it happens without, right? So that's one of the ways that Microsoft looks at its own business strategy, is really using its own human capital, right? If we look at our own employees, giving our own employees a platform, communities, so that we drive what is passionate to us as individuals, and then that cascades out, right? So that's one of the metrics that we record here at Microsoft, is just our own employee-driven action, and how that is able to expand our position of influence internally. The other piece of it is reporting, and then also once you understand the context, to reduce, right? Reduce your resources use, and with more efficiency and improvements. And one of the things that we like to talk about is this data feedback loop, right? Where we are really informing through our solutions how to then ask better questions, right? So that we can get better results. So we're not working within a static framework, but a dynamic feedback loop, a feedback system where we're able to use data to drive better decision making. Then moving to removing removing carbon and GHG emissions, and we're able to come up with verifiable ways for sequestration, and then replacing hydrocarbon-driven electricity with renewables, and then also being able to develop more sustainable technology practices. So on our next slide, I'm not sure if this was the last one. Yeah, okay. So that's where I'll end. And definitely, there's a lot that we worked with, at Microsoft around our kind of robust goals around sustainability. But just really on a personal level, one of the things that's really important to me is how we're able to talk about technology and sustainability together, where we really look at technology as an enabler for our sustainability goals. And again, like I mentioned in the beginning, when we're using technology in this way, it's important to drive the outcomes first, where it is that we're trying to get to, what it is that we're trying to do, and then from a business and industry standpoint, what are those specific outcomes that are going to drive a sustainable future, and then take technology to enable those outcomes.
Don, I get smarter every time I talk to you. That was great. And I think because, and let's start with where you ended. Okay, technology as an enabler. Excuse me. We're innovating our we're innovating our reactor technologies. Obviously, we're excited about that. But it sounds like if we were to show up on the doorstep of Microsoft with 15 new reactors, that may not be what you want to hear. Do you want so when you're evaluating a technology to fit into a sustainable portfolio, what do you need to know about that technology? What makes that technology investable or demonstratable? Because I imagine that you guys are doing some of your own demonstration work as well. So, but talk about maybe that aspect of it.
Sure. So, I mean, I can talk to what I do. I don't necessarily sit in R&D, but when we're evaluating technologies to see how they will work towards sustainability, and I can just kind of speak to what I do. It's quite literally what I just spoke about. I don't lead with the technology first. I can think of a number of different technologies that are enabling some fantastic outcomes right now. I mean, I can think about LiDAR and satellites, drones, blockchain in the global carbon registry that's emerging from several different consortiums, and we'll see which one kind of takes hold. There's a number of enabling technologies to that end. And I mean, honestly, you know, there's a number of different factors that are considered. I think for myself, when I'm looking at net new technologies, a lot has to do with what the science is saying about that technology, what the researchers are saying, what the academics are saying, what the market is saying. You know, I look at a number of different factors. I'm looking at I look at the analysts around market and market share, market trends. I dive into the industries that would utilize those technologies. So when you're talking about nuclear, I look at the utilities, the power and utility companies, what they're doing from a research standpoint within their own companies, how they view that technology, and how they're looking to use it. And then I go from that standpoint and look for blockers. You know, sometimes blockers come in the form of maybe the technology is in more of a prototype or design phase. And so it's not necessarily ready for scale. And so depending on what the business need is, if they need a scaled technology solution and that technology is not ready for that, then that's not a technology that we would necessarily land in that situation. So I think that I don't know if that was a little bit of a circuitous answer, but it really depends on what you're using it for, right? And then what is the demand for that technology? And if there isn't a demand, then why not? Because a lot of times the market self-corrects, you know, if that technology is not ready.
Okay, so you talked to, as a global company, and you start to look at sustainability. Do you look at regions differently when you look at sustainability for that particular region relative to water and land? You've talked quite a bit about your, you know, understanding your footprint, and all of those other technologies you just mentioned, GIS, LiDAR, all those types of things. I can imagine very data rich to help that evaluation as well. But can you talk a little bit about when you consider drought concerns going forward in different regions, does that make you look at maybe carbon capture technology differently to meet a carbon negative goal?
Yeah, so you know, taking my Microsoft hat on and putting my scientist hat on, then absolutely, right? So, you know, as a geoscientist, every region has a different type of, you know, either, you know, geologic regime, atmospheric, climate type of regime that impacts the companies and how they do their business, right? And even from, you know, we're looking at it from a climate change perspective, different parts of the globe are impacted differently depending on what type of, you know, fluctuations are being seen as a result of climate change. So we have to take those things as separate, right? Because they're not the same. And so the way that we would apply the technology and the type of business challenges that companies that exist in those parts of the globe are different, right? And then, you know, you take it from the standpoints of geopolitics. So, you know, Colin was talking a lot about policy, and especially policy here in the United States. That drives business behavior. That drives how technology is, it can be readily adopted in some cases. So from a geopolitical standpoint, EMEA behaves differently than Asia, and Asia Pacific behaves differently than the United States and the Americas. So so we have to look at it differently from a policy standpoint, and then also from a data sovereignty standpoint, and then even from in some cases from a technology standpoint and what can be deployed and for what reasons.
Okay. So looking at, can you talk a little bit, I know there's been just a bit of a journey associated with the between recording the data and reporting the data. I've read a little bit about working with your supply chain to get some consistency across that such that it can be useful to you and your work.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk just a little bit about about that in general? Just, I mean, you know, as a scientist, right, you need your data to be comparable.
Yeah,
How hard was
absolutely.
that?
It's hard, right? So you're talking about being able to report mostly scope 3 emissions when we're talking about the our suppliers and looking at across our supply chain, and it is very difficult. So one of the things that we've done is we've updated our supplier code of conduct. We've started putting new requirements on our suppliers so that we can better calculate and report our scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions around all of the greenhouse gas emission data. So that's one of the things that we've done. We've also made a lot of progress on our sustainability calculator to really be able to innovate around ways that we're making this calculation, and then also across all of our product lines, including into lifing our product lines and how much emissions they produce, and being able to track, monitor, track, and report those. We've also launched a new coalition with 8 other leading corporations. It's called Transform to Net Zero. And this is really where we're making a number of resources available to accelerate business action and really to help not only ourselves, because this is a learning curve, right? We've made robust commitments, knowing that this is something net new. We're going to make mistakes, we're going to fail, we're going to learn, and we're going to get up and keep trying, right? And keep moving towards this goal. So part of that is being able to work across all of the largest corporations who've made these type of goals, and have this shared learning, not just amongst ourselves, but with everybody, as transparent as we can. We want to bring with us the planet, right? Because it is part of our mission that for Microsoft to do well, the world needs to do well. So that is part of our mission and our business strategy.
Yeah, I was in reading the blog from January. I thought it was amazing. So not only did you did a request for proposal to remove 1 million metric tons of carbon, but the response was great. You had 189 projects. But for those projects that you didn't fund, you guys shared that information. It's out there to read. So even if you didn't, if it wasn't a fit for you now, you shared it, I guess, in the spirit that it might be a fit for someone else.
Yeah, you know, absolutely. I think that this is different, right? We're not just in it for ourselves. We're in it for more altruistic goals, you know. And I think that one of the ways that just, you know, again, this is Don James talking. You know, I think that it is a different kind of organizational strategy that we're seeing here, where you know, we're taking the company's stance of transparency so that we all can learn, because this isn't a Microsoft problem, this is a global problem. And we see, just like a lot of organizations that I work with, partners and customers, we see in real time where the impacts to climate change are impacting our business, impacting us as individuals, right? We are right in the middle of a global pandemic. I live in Houston, where we had a major power outage. I was without electricity for over two days with small children. It got to 14 degrees in the house, right? So, you know, we're all in the middle of it, right? So Microsoft has infused within its business strategy, its organizational structure, to do better and do more within, the scope of what it can, within its position of influence and who we impact within our sphere of impact, to do whatever we can do, whatever it is that we can think of in a programmatic, systematic way, to drive the planet to this carbon carbon neutral zone. So we're not as so dramatically impacted by these changes to the climate, especially weather fluctuations.
So so maybe the billion-dollar question, and I know both of us are in the middle of reading How to Avoid a Climate Disaster by Microsoft's founder, Bill Gates, and
That's true.
Everyone is fully aware of his investment in the TerraPower and his interest in nuclear power over many years. And I think it, for our audience, it's fair to say Don is not here to proclaim that Microsoft is about to buy multiple reactors, but can you talk about, I think it's important, your willingness to even be here in a nuclear community and interested in the technology. And I think that speaks to the transparency and the dedication to look at everything. I do hope, as you and I have talked, this is the first conversation of many where we continue to learn from Microsoft. And I think it is important. You and I are going to have a separate conversation. I want to know what that sustainability calculator is. But for those of us that are, focused on a particular technology, where do we start with getting smarter about sustainability and what that really means and how to think about that? I'm sure for many of us that was not something that was taught in school. It was not like your economics class, right?
Yeah.
But is there a recommended starting place around sustainability that you would send us?
Yeah,
sorry to put you on the spot on that one.
A little bit on the spot, but that's okay. And I can certainly speak to what I understand, right? I'm not speaking on behalf of the company and any sort of official policies or anything like that. But it's my pleasure to be here. I am here as a scientist and as an environmental scientist. And, the way I understand, our carbon negative goal and then where we're moving to carbon-free energy sources and renewables, to me, there's no technology that's not on the table, right? We're looking at the entire solution set in its entirety. I don't think that there's one silver bullet. I don't think that there's one technology that's going to save us, right? I don't think there's not one person, there's not one organization, right? We're all in it together, right? I think that it's going to take a number of intersecting technologies from a utilities and a smart grid perspective. One of the questions that I get asked a lot is underserved communities, countries with that experience energy poverty, when we start having these kind of environmental discussions around oil and gas. And I come from the oil and gas sector. And energy poverty, environmental justice is a very close to my heart, and it's a very big issue to me. And so from a nuclear standpoint, it's one of the only carbon-free energy sources that is ubiquitous, right? So can solve a very important piece to consistency to that generation mix. of electricity. So from my perspective, and how to avoid climate disaster, and even a lot of the research that I'm seeing come out, not only is it very promising, but like I mentioned, there's going to be a technology-based solution and a nature-based solutions when it comes to solving the energy challenge in a carbon-free way, in a sustainable way, and how we're going to stack these things together. And then, as we talked about before, right, when we start looking at this from a global scale and looking at from a geopolitical perspective, not every source of energy, right, not source of energy generation is going to be a fit for every country, right? So we have to look at different technology-based solutions depending on where we are in the world, depending on what kind of geologic regime, socio-political regime, these type of things. So from my standpoint, once again, no technology is off the table. We have to look at all of the pros and cons, and then also look at how it fits within the context of our entire energy landscape. So that's where I sit. I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to learn more. And just like we were talking before, a big reason why I'm here is because I want to learn, right? I want to learn more. I know what I've read. I know what I've learned from school. I know where I stand today from, carbon-free energy sources. But I want to learn more. I want to learn about what you all are doing. I definitely want to dig into what Colin is working on in his think tank, and looking at other sources of renewable energies. But again, no technology is off the table. And I think that from some of the conversations that we were having previously, I think that there is some assumptions that are made with nuclear energy, just like, with the production of hydrocarbons. And, one of the things that I talk to, and hopefully your audience will agree, is that when we start looking at it from an engineering standpoint, when we start looking at it as from the engine that powers our modern civilization, right? We have to change, right? It doesn't mean that it's that we just turn off, right, these sources of energy, because there's parts of the world that depend on it. From an energy poverty standpoint, there's parts of the United States that depend on it. So it's not that we turn it off, it's that we transition. And in that transition, we don't throw anything away, right? We change.
Boy, that is a wonderful place to end. And again, thank you so very much. I know for those of you that don't know, getting permission to have Microsoft speak is not an easy feat. So I appreciate your help and your willingness to come and talk to us and share your perspective. And again, I look forward to talking again soon.
Absolutely.
Thank you. All right, so let's transition, which that was a great lead in. Kirsty, I don't know that I did not plan that. That was just amazing. But a lead in to really all the things that you and I have been talking about, going to the end, right? Looking at this from a perspective of what energy could be before we dive into what do we need to do today. And I think this is where I'm excited for you and Eric to talk about beyond electricity, heat, other fuels. And I think this really serves, this webinar, the first two here really serve as a platform for us to have some conversations about innovation. For the nuclear community, Kirsty and Eric probably don't need much of an introduction. If you haven't read their reports, you're really missing out. And I'll just put in that personal plug. It's not necessarily beach reading, but I will say it's quite enjoyable as a scientist the creativity, and you know, I think also the way that you guys present your information is quite fresh. So Kirsty and Eric are the founders of TerraPraxis and I would call them a think tank. I think they have been pivotal in helping people imagine what all of this could be and helping us to think through this. So with that, I'm going to stop talking. Eric, are you going first?
Yeah, I'm just going to do a little intro about what TerraPraxis is, and
Okay.
then Kirsty will take over and present for a while, and then at some point she'll hand it back to me. So
Okay, well, I'm going to go away and let you guys do your thing.
Thanks. And I think, you know, although we didn't prearrange it, I think it was very helpful that Dawn ended by saying kind of how big the problem really is. And so, you know, one way to think about how big the problem is that current liquid fossil fuel use is 1,000 barrels a second. So, you know, each time you blink, that's another 1,000 barrels. And the scale of that, the scale in terms of the amount of energy, the amount of carbon emissions, the number of people involved in making that happen, the number of people who depend on that and use it all over the global economy, it's really kind of mind-boggling, actually. And it's such a big number, it's such a big amount of stuff, it's such a big part of the economy that we tend to almost not want to look at it, because it's actually quite difficult to think about how we're going to transform that much economic activity, that much energy use into something very different and clean, and something which does not force a trade-off between the conveniences of modern life and the safety and the health benefits of having a high energy economy, and the need for the developing world to also expand their use of energy to get those things. So this kind of problematic is actually the problematic that TerraPraxis was founded to address. So we wanted to bring innovation, technological innovation and strategy, and kind of the work that we've done in leading change in business and non-business environments to actually the problem of designing scalable solutions. And so sometimes that design is thinking of something maybe that hasn't been thought of before. Many times it's bringing together things that many people have thought of and finding a way to package them into solutions that can get more traction and that can have important pieces of their commercialization pathway de-risked or accelerated. And so what we're going to share with you today is some of the work that we've been doing in this regard to both build scalable models for decarbonization and scalable models that address the kind of neglected or difficult to decarbonize sectors. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kirsty Gogan, who seems to have Marisol's name underneath her.
Oh.
But
Oops. Yeah.
it definitely is Kirsty. And
sorry about that, everybody. I just had a little roller coaster, sharing my screen, got kicked out, had to get back in again. Hopefully you're all seeing my screen. And
yes.
Oh, wonderful. And I've changed my name. So Eric, thank you so much. And gosh, what a hard act to follow. These discussions so far have just been really wonderful. It's really a joy to be here. So thank you, Christine, for inviting us to contribute. Yeah, let's get into it. So I'd like to just start by kind of zooming us out a little bit to see, what the kind of current status report really is. And this slide is it's from the IEA, the International Energy Agency's World Energy Outlook, but it's really consistent with all the mainstream projections for future energy use. And they all really indicate that at least 50% of our energy is still projected to come from fossil fuels by 2050. And that is, you know, assuming a really successful, really ambitious build out of wind and solar. As you can see, you know, there's a pretty impressive build out of renewables there. But we still have some really tough to decarbonize parts of the economy for which we really don't have good answers right now. And those are listed there on the side. You can see that we still anticipate a lot of gas-fired power plants, you know, balancing renewables, for example, in the grid, still a heavy dependence on gas for industrial purposes, still a really large amount of coal-fired power plants, you know, 2 terawatts of coal still generating by mid-century, and then liquid fossil fuels, particularly for those heavy transport applications like aviation and shipping. And by contrast, before I go on, just to say that what we're really looking at here is actually a 3 to 4 degree warming trajectory. So that's really far from our 1.5 to 2 degree targets that we set in the Paris goals. But if we were to try to meet those Paris goals, if we're trying to go,
Christy, if I could just say one thing about that graph.
Yeah, please.
That's also incorporating, that assumes all the stated commitments that people have made are implemented and effective.
Yeah.
So this is not
so that's a big assumption.
Scenario.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. I mean, actually, the stated policies right now that you know, the national determined commitments that have been made ahead of the COP26 conference coming up in Glasgow at the end of this year amount to around 0.5 degrees and 0.5% emissions cuts, and we actually need to be something closer to 45% emissions cuts by 2030. So we're really far in terms of the levels of ambition, and that's even, I guess, what we haven't done is taken into account the UK's announcements today. But this is what we need to do globally. Many of you will be familiar with this chart. It's from the IPCC 2018 1.5 degrees famous report that really, you know, helped wake the world up to, you know, the urgency of climate change in 2018. And Eric, when he presents this slide, you know, he says, well, I like to ski, but I wouldn't like to ski down this slope because it is extremely steep. And as we've helpfully annotated there, you can see that we really do have an awful lot to do within a very short time. And the eagle-eyed amongst you will see that actually hitting zero is about 2/3 of the way down the chart. In fact, beyond zero, we also then need to spend the second half of this century extracting carbon emissions from the atmosphere. So actually the carbon negative commitments that Microsoft have made are really leading edge. And we would anticipate that that's going to become more and more the case, that it's not even just acceptable to be carbon neutral, but actually carbon negative is going to be the expectation. So in the meantime, to get to zero, well, what do we need to do? We need to repower all of those coal plants, replace those flexible gas plants, replace gas for industrial heat, replace liquid fossil fuels, all whilst growing the energy system to supply the developing world, which isn't just an afterthought. In fact, you know, this is a critical detail that really isn't, we think, properly represented in our climate mitigation strategies, which is that in order to meet rising global energy demand, not only do we need to replace our entire global fossil fuel infrastructure, but possibly double or even triple it to meet rising global energy demand. So what can we learn from fast food? We have a sort of theory of change that, you know, in order to achieve this very, very ambitious clean energy transition within incredibly challenging timescales, we're used to saying 30 years to 2050. It's actually 29 years to 2050. We like to use the analogy of the Impossible Burger, which, for those of you who don't know, is a plant-based meat substitute that you can buy in almost any Burger King now across America. And it's really interesting because it acts like a drop-in substitute in terms of cost and performance. In other words, it looks like a burger, it tastes like a burger, it costs the same as a burger, and you can buy it through the existing supply chains. So it's leveraging existing infrastructure, it's cost competitive with its alternative. It doesn't depend on behavior change or the consumer making ethical decisions or sacrifices, and it's available at a scale which is relevant to the market size. And then, of course, crucially, it's really rapidly deployable. So it's, as I said, it's now scaled up and deployed fully across the whole market. So what we like to do is to take this analogy and then think about how we can apply those key characteristics in the design of climate solutions. So we're going to introduce to you during this presentation some impossible burgers for climate, transformative solutions that are really designed to address those hard to decarbonize areas that we showed you a moment ago. And here they are. Here's the 4 impossible burgers that we're going to step through today. You can see here we have a flexible generator. We have cogeneration of electricity and fuels. We have a really interesting coal plant conversion strategy that we'll describe to you at the end, which is our next big project that's in the works. And then the hydrogen and synthetic fuels markets, which are really very, very large markets. And what these all have in common is very innovative applications for emerging advanced heat sources that are being commercialized in the 2020s. But crucially, they're also designed around the organizing principles of cost and speed and scale and space. And those 4 organizing principles, are really critical to achieving that impossible burger characteristic. But wait, before we go forward, we do have a sort of a perception of nuclear energy informed by recent experience in the United States and Europe, flowing from first of a kind, first in a generation projects, building very, very complex, highly regulated mega projects. These first of a kind projects, of course, Vogel in the United States and the EPRs that are being built in the UK and Finland and France, have indeed created an impression that nuclear is, perhaps too expensive and slow for us really to depend too heavily upon it for our climate mitigation strategies. Well, Eric and I have spent years really understanding what drives the cost of nuclear projects, and we've published really extensively on this topic. And it's not just our work, but actually our findings and the evidence that we've collected from learning from nuclear projects and nuclear programs around the world is really consistent with the outputs from organizations like MIT and the OECD NEA and the IAEA and many other organizations as well. And what we found is it's really actually a very simple set of very understandable factors that drive these cost outcomes. When you're building a highly regulated, complex mega project for the first time in a generation, you have to make a really significant investment in restarting that industry and qualifying your supply chain and licensing your design, building it for the first time, and in the process of doing that, establishing skills and capability within the supply chain, within the labor force, within the project leadership teams, and of course also even with the regulator. Generally what has happened is that those projects are started without a completed design, and that leads to all kinds of delays and changes that are required as the design gets more developed, leading to issues around specifications with the supply chain or change requests from the regulator, all of which contributes towards delays and budget increases and inevitably schedule extensions. But what's really interesting is that once you've got through that first project, and we've seen this repeatedly, and in all countries really around the world that have successfully built more than one unit. Even in the UK, where we're building 2 units, by the time you move on to unit number 2, you've really sort of ironed out most of those first of a kind issues. Your design is complete, your supply chain is qualified, your labor force knows what they're doing, you've started to optimize the construction schedule, your site is up and running, and essentially you don't have to spend those first time costs again. So what we're expecting to see as we move from the first project to the second of a kind or nth of a kind project in the UK, for example, is at least a 30% or even more, 30 to 40% reduction in cost from the first project to the second. Just to give you some numbers there, in the UK, the Hinkley Point C project was £92.50 per megawatt hour. We depending on the financing model for Sizewell C, the second of a kind, the consumer could be paying as little as £40 per megawatt hour, so almost a 50% reduction in cost for the second project. And that's achieved through freezing the design and sequencing across the skills and capable supply chain. And ultimately, if you keep doing that, what you then start to move into is a programmatic effect. And that's what we've seen happening very successfully in many countries around the world, including, once upon a time in the US, but also, in Sweden, in France, in Korea, and most recently in Barakah, the UAE project, where 4 units were built on a single site, leading to, very substantially reduced design costs and reduced prices for equipment and materials, an optimized schedule, a much more experienced and highly skilled workforce, and a more competitive supply chain. And then the real next step change after that, after your programmatic cost reduction, is when you move from a traditional sort of construction-based project approach to a much more manufactured-based, product-based approach. And that's when really you start to move into a different paradigm where you have a product that's designed for manufacture and assembly, that's really optimized to reduce direct costs, and you're operating in a much more high productivity manufacturing and delivery environment, enabling much more optimized schedules and increased rate of deployment as well. So that's the sort of steps to low cost, the pathway to low cost, and that's really the sort of logic with which we've designed some of these impossible burgers that we'll go on to now. So here they are. So first of all, we're going to look at flexible generation. We published a report last year that was commissioned by ARPA-E, looking at the cost and performance requirements for advanced reactors in future electricity markets. And the first thing to say is that we found that if advanced reactor developers can deliver their products for less than $3,000 a kilowatt, then they will have very large markets. So really our goal with this report was, rather than sort of figure out how much these designs are going to cost, it's much more important for us to inform upstream design decisions to really sort of define what the market and cost requirements are, to support designers in really sort of making good decisions and delivering very useful products. And one of the key performance characteristics that we identified as being really valuable in future electricity grids is going to be being flexible and dispatchable. And this is to enable future advanced reactors to support high penetrations of variable renewables in future electricity grids. And here you see the Natrium design actually sort of delivering against that with their nuclear island in the foreground there, which is separated from the conventional power island via thermal energy storage. And this enables the reactor to run all the time and either be charging the battery, as it were, so charging up the thermal energy storage, which can then dispatch to the grid when prices are high, or indeed discharge directly to the grid. So this means that the plant is running at its maximum allowable capacity at 90% or more, but also enabling the overall plant to become a flexible generator. And this is really high value in future electricity grids that have high penetrations of variable renewables like wind and solar, and really creates an overall optimized energy system in terms of cost for the consumer, but also, of course, in terms of the other things that we care about in our electricity systems, things like reliability and carbon emissions and flexibility. So this is a great design. It's wonderful to see Natrium, which is the joint venture between TerraPower and GE Hitachi, and of course it's one of the ARDP awardees by the DOE, putting this into practice. And we're going to come back to this very clever design innovation, separating the nuclear island from the conventional power island in a moment, because it's really useful for other things too. But one thing I would just add is that, you know, it's also, we really like this design because it's what it's doing is de-scoping the kind of nuclear bit of the project. So the regulatory oversight is contained within that fence there that's around the nuclear island in the foreground. And the power island, which is in the background there, you know, can be supplied by conventional suppliers and can even be built in parallel. So you know, you can have construction in parallel to the nuclear island being built. So this brings all sorts of cost benefits and schedule benefits, and overall de-risks the construction project for the consumer, for the investor, for the customer. So we'll look now at the flexible cogeneration, which is the next impossible burger solution. And this is you know, really about expanding the value proposition of nuclear energy. I think, you know, we've sort of traditionally thought about nuclear as being a kind of plodding workhorse of the energy system, providing baseload, very, very valuable, not under, you know, nothing against it, but nonetheless a bit of a one-trick pony, let's say, baseload power generation. Whereas actually, because nuclear energy produces not only potentially, if it's delivered well, low cost and very reliable, high capacity factor electricity, of course they also produce heat. And when you combine those two things, you can actually broaden the range of energy services that you know, are, you know, have never really been more valuable than they are today, when we're really starting to think hard about how to decarbonize not only our electricity system, but other parts of our economy as well, like such as heat and transport, and industry, which are really tough to decarbonize, as we know. So here is just a very simple diagram showing this application for an advanced heat source supplying electricity, co-generating hydrogen and power, but also being potentially able to be dedicated to hydrogen production, as well as also separately supplying heat. And this isn't just limited to advanced heat sources, the next generation technologies that are being commercialized in the 2020s. In fact, we're seeing existing fleet, so existing nuclear plants, you know, beginning to sort of diversify the energy services that they're supplying in some of the really difficult, you know, the tough electricity markets in the United States right now. And we're seeing new build light water gigawatt scale reactors like the Sizewell C project in the UK, looking at incorporating the direct supply of heat to industry and households, as well as adding electrolyzers into their project, with the option then to make hydrogen as well. So really much more flexible, much more versatile, and really, really valuable. So now we're going to talk about fuels. I think Eric mentioned in the opening remarks, you know, this is a really large market, 100 million barrels of oil per day that we currently use. And for many of the, you know, uses for that oil, we really don't have good alternatives. It's really difficult to imagine electrifying aviation and shipping, for example. So hydrogen is becoming, you know, much more recognized as a decarbonization tool. It's a hot topic right now, and the way that we have thought about it is rather than as an end-use fuel, we prefer to think about, you know, the use of hydrogen as an ingredient in drop-in substitute fuels. And the reason for that is because it means that we can repurpose much of the existing storage, transport, and distribution infrastructure if we're deploying alternative fuels like ammonia and synthetic hydrocarbons, rather than hydrogen as an end-use fuel, which would require its, you know, an entirely new associated infrastructure to store it and move it around. And that's before we even discuss, you know, the end uses as well. So using ammonia or synthetic hydrocarbons would enable, largely the repurposing of the existing end-use infrastructure as well. And we think that given the scale of the transition that's required within the timescales that we're working within, those kinds of criteria are going to become extremely important. So the hydrogen would need to be extremely cheap if we were going to use it in that way. And you can see here on this chart that for hydrogen to be used as an ingredient in ammonia or synthetic hydrocarbons within the price ranges that we're used to paying for existing oil prices that are shown there in those horizontal bars across the bottom of the chart, the hydrogen would need to cost really less than $1.50 a kilogram if it was to be used to make ammonia, and really a lot less than that if it's going to get down into the low oil prices category. So less than $1 a kilogram is the target price, about 90 cents is the target price that we're looking for hydrogen production, which is really challenging. And just to give you a sense, I mean, the current sort of ambitious projected costs of hydrogen produced from renewables, it's not even on this chart. I mean, it's way over $3 or $4 a kilogram. It doesn't sound like a lot, but when you put it into the context of oil prices, then you begin to appreciate the context we're working in. Oh, sorry about that. So how can we do that? Well, one of the sort of interesting things about moving away from a sort of traditional utilities-based model where your options for building a nuclear plant project are really constrained by the sort of power purchase agreement and the transmission availability and the demand from the electricity market, is that you're moving much more towards a commodities-based model where you're producing a product, whether that's ammonia or hydrogen or synthetic hydrocarbons. You're moving much more towards a product that can be stored and transported and exported to global markets. And this has a really big effect on the nature of your siting, both in terms of location, firstly. So this is a refinery scale synthetic fuel gigafactory, which has 36 advanced heat sources, and there's a fully integrated manufacturing, installation and assembly project, which incorporates the factory there at the back. The grey shed at the back there is manufacturing the components, which are then being installed. You can see in the center, producing hydrogen and then producing synthetic fuels on site. The integrated nature of this project, which we'd like to describe as bringing the factory to your project, means that you are able to produce very, very low cost hydrogen, and really at quite a large scale. And part of the economy here is in the scale. If you were just making electricity, it would be very difficult to commission a project of this size, but because you're producing fuels that can be then exported to markets, you're really liberated in that sense. We modelled the hydrogen gigafactory with the Synfuel plant into the UK's net zero model, in collaboration with the Energy Systems Catapult. And this is a great chart because it really shows the effect of having large volumes of very low cost fuels production being delivered into the market. It enables almost an immediate switch from fossil fuel based aviation fuel to synthetic fuels. So this is really, there's an impossible burger in action for you. If you can compete with the existing fossil fuel prices and deliver at a scale which is relevant to that market, then these kinds of clean energy transitions really are suddenly within our grasp. This is another chart just sort of giving you a sense of the expectations that are currently out there around aviation fuel costs for sustainable aviation fuel. This is a cost estimate from the International Energy Agency, which is based on aviation biofuel production costs, and the dark green bar there, which is 2 or 3 times more expensive than existing aviation fuel today. We think that this is a very problematic climate mitigation strategy, to expect that not only will people be prepared to pay more, but also, you know, depending, like basing these strategies on biofuels, you know, where you're competing with land use for, you know, other purposes, whether that's food production or wildlife habitats and biodiversity. I remind you again of the sort of organizing principles with which we base our strategies on, which is cost and speed and scale and space. And one of the great advantages of nuclear energy, of course, as I'm sure you all know, is it's very it's power density, which means it has a really tiny environmental footprint. And with its high capacity factors and the combination of power and heat, where you're really able to sort of produce at a scale and a volume which is relevant to these markets, whilst having a very small environmental footprint. I'm going to show you another approach here, which is the shipyard construction. So this is, you know, a moment ago with the gigafactory, you saw how we bring the factory to the project, and this is when you bring the project to the factory, in this case to a world-class, high productivity shipyard. And we see here the modular blocks are being added to a floating platform construction, which is really akin to the kind of thing that you'd see in the oil and gas sector. This is under construction in a dry dock. And here's the finished product. This is an artist's impression of an ammonia production platform offloading onto an ammonia bunker there for export to the shipping industry, to be used directly as fuel. Of course, the International Marine Organization has indicated that ammonia would be its preferred alternative fuel to the diesel that they use today. And just, you know, the reason we focus on shipping is because, you know, if shipping was a country, it would be the 5th largest economy in the world in terms of emissions. So this is a really large market. And what's really interesting for me about this approach is that it's really leveraging the existing oil and gas capability, for which these kinds of offshore production platforms are, you know, very familiar. They have many advantages and benefits in terms of siting flexibility again, and combining that with the existing world-class capability in global shipyards today, which will, as we'll see in a moment, are already really underutilized. What we're developing here are strategies that are really complementary to the existing strategies focused on the deployment of wind and solar, but we're not competing for the same, you know, access to the same supply chains, or indeed even to the same siting options. Here we see a multi-product platform. This is my favorite one. This is envisaged to be moored off the coast of Ghana. And this platform is making hydrogen and power and ammonia, all of which can be delivered to the nearby markets depending on demand. But it's also using the waste heat for the desalination and the production of fresh water, enough fresh water, in fact, to supply the majority of the city region of Accra. So this really is a sort of, you know, a multi-purpose platform that addresses many of the energy and energy services needs of the developing world without the requirement to build, you know, terrestrial infrastructure projects on land, which, you know, can, you know, which is really problematic right now in many of these countries, both partly because, you know, it's a very challenging investment environment, but also because, you know, it requires, you know, a upskilling and a large investment to enable the skills and capability within the workforce and the supply chain to enable the delivery of those infrastructure projects. So this really is a sort of, you know, a fast track opportunity to support economic development in countries around the world. So I'm gonna hand over to Eric now to discuss with us some of those climate scale constraints that we talked about earlier: cost and speed, scale and space. Eric, over to you.
So Great job, Kirsty. So this is just a reprise of Kirsty's comments earlier about the difference between first of a kind and program build. And this is sort of multiple projects averaged into cost buckets, but you see there's really a very, very significant step change between a first of a kind, where you're basically investing in setting everything up, and the marginal cost of building units when you have a program well established. And a large number of the nuclear plants built in the world that are still operating were built under were essentially built under the sort of framework that led to cost in the second bar. Next slide. So Kirsty was showing some pictures of shipyard manufactured plants, and there are a number of advanced nuclear startups that are pursuing this as a delivery model. And so we show here a kind of a cost reduction step that occurs when you if you decide to build in a kind of production environment of a shipyard, you get another reduction of approximately 50% or more in the cost. And this is because many of your indirect costs go away or are reduced. And it also is because you're moving, you're basically building out of steel instead of concrete, and you're building in the most productive environments, manufacturing environments in the world. So these are places where they regularly crank out, many $150 million ships per year. So this is like literally like bringing your project to the best factory. Next slide. So this just shows the sequence of steps. And by the way, our shipyard estimate is based on, the first one is based on using light water reactors in a shipyard. So it's not assuming any cost reduction benefits from advanced reactors. We then have two more estimates. One shows that when you use advanced reactors, you will get an additional reduction in cost. Part of that's from the higher efficiency that you get from having a higher temperature heat source, and part of it is from some other reductions in size and scope of what's required. We believe that there's yet another a point on this cost reduction curve, which is when you really move from a design that would enable you to build 10 or 20 of these things to when you turn this into something like a mass produced or high volume manufacturing product. And we believe that involves kind of reoptimization of a lot of things in the system, but it will reduce costs further and reduce a number of other costs as well that don't show up here. This is just capital cost. But there's a long way, there's a lot of possibility here for cost reduction. Next slide. So we then, after developing this kind of notional design for the fuel production platforms for decarbonizing the oil and gas industry, we then said, how quickly could you do this? Or if you were trying to do it by 2050, how many of these platforms would you need? And how many ships would you have to make a year? So on the left side, you see that is the number of ships per year. And keep in mind that there are about 60,000 ships operating today, large commercial ships and fishing ships and so forth. So when you look at the global shipyard capacity for manufacturing these types of things, you couldn't probably do 1,000 platforms a year today, but you could do hundreds today. And there's certainly enough capacity in the global shipyard industry to scale up and deliver this 14,000 platforms that would be needed by 2050 to decarbonize oil and gas. Next slide. So yes, we also looked at kind of how many additions would you need in terms of building, adding shipyards to your production queue and what was the total number of shipyards. And there's about 250 sort of large and medium-sized shipyards in the world, and this would take the output of about 60 of them. So this would be a bunch of hard work, and everybody would have to kind of pull together, and we'd have to, this is not an easy path, but this is a doable path, and it's within the production capacity of the people that make the stuff that goes into ships and all of that. So this is a sort of an additional pathway for decarbonization that's not currently modeled into that scenario that Kirsty showed at the beginning of the presentation. Next slide. So we also looked at, based on the projected cost of these platforms, what would it cost? What would be the total investment required to decarbonize the oil and gas industry by 2050? So first we looked at what are the estimates for keeping the flow of oil and gas that we have today. In other words, what is the projected investment that the oil and gas industry is planning to make based on their projections of how much oil and gas will be needed between now and 2050? And if you look at that, it's about between 24 and 25 trillion dollars of investment. If you decided to make all that hydrogen and syn fuel with renewables, you would need about 70 trillion. And this assumes, by the way, that you don't start that major investment until the late 2030s, when renewables costs have come down a lot. So we're assuming here kind of a very low cost renewables case, and that all of that could be done, when the costs are low. That's about 70 trillion. If you look at the costs and designs that we were just showing, we think this could be done for about 16 to 17 trillion. So this looks like it would be lower total investment cost than continuing to invest in finding oil and pumping it out of the ground. Next slide. So we also looked at Kirsty was mentioning that it's cost and scale and speed and space. So the need for space is very significant when you look at deploying offshore wind and you look at deploying solar. So this is the land area and ocean area requirements to make the hydrogen equivalent to the UK's oil consumption. So this is just a metric, right? This isn't necessarily what the strategy would be, but to give you an idea of the scale of oil consumption and the scale of producing that through these different methods, the red is the size of the single offshore wind farm you would need. That's not the area where you would put your wind farms. That is one wind farm that big. And the gold box, the yellow box, is a solar project that is that big. And the green box is the sort of gigafactory size that you would need to produce all of that hydrogen. So there's clearly a big difference in the scale, and that difference shows up not just in sort of costs or avoid things that you can't do with the land since you're using it for this, but it also shows up in how many people you have to touch and how many people have to be on board with doing this. And we think this is one of the principal risks that we face right now. So we're doing this not because we're nuclear advocates, but because we're climate hawks. And we see huge risks with the scale of build out that's necessary. And these risks are not the absolute amount of land, or, we all know that the sun delivers enough energy to the planet, to power all of human civilization in 9 minutes or whatever it is, 10 minutes, 50 minutes. That's not the point. The point is, how do we get the stuff built in time and not have huge opposition from people who, who want their view to be different or who don't like having solar panels built in their neighborhoods. And this isn't an abstract idea. This is something that's already impacting the deployment of renewable technologies very severely in Germany and in the UK and other places. So here's another example for Japan, and you can see extremely similar kind of the offshore wind thing. It would be so big that you'd have a lot of problems with Korea and China trying to do that. The solar is unrealistically large, and there's a nice little couple of giga refineries there, which you can barely see. So next slide. So I think the last application that we wanted to talk about is, we've talked about flexibility, cogeneration, and the sort of dedicated fuels production. The last big sort of bar on the chart at the beginning of the talk was the amount of coal generation that is expected to still be operating in the 40s and 50s. And in the US, we currently have 264 gigawatts of coal. We have a relatively old coal fleet, but the global coal fleet, half of the global coal fleet is less than 15 years old. And in fact, the average age of the global coal fleet is getting younger every year, which means that we're losing the very old plants kind of quickly, and we're building quite a lot of new plants still. It's a big part of US generation today. The coal plants don't have high capacity factors, but it's still almost 1 billion tons of CO2 per year, and there's about 60,000 jobs just at coal plants. So it's a noticeable impact in terms of employment and community preservation and so forth. And if you go to the next slide, we also see that here the coal plants are color coded by which party's congressional districts they're in. And so what you see is that it isn't just one political party, but you do see that there are a lot of Republican districts that have coal plants in them, and that a kind of let's just shut the coal plants down strategy is not going to be very popular or easy to implement. On the other hand, if we could repower these with advanced heat sources, we could provide between 20 and 40% of the needed clean electricity for the 2050 net zero scenarios, which require a doubling of electricity consumption, by the way, from today, with no new transmission build. And most of the scenarios for that decarbonization, even ones that use quite a lot of natural gas with CCS and some nuclear, still require that the grid be increased by 250%. That is also going to be extremely challenging to accomplish. And the large-scale renewables build-out requires this kind of grid expansion. So we not only have to have a lot of cooperative people where we want to build the renewables, but we also have to be able to build a lot of transmission to connect those. Those are two different things, and they're both risky. So if we want to reduce risk, this is not to say we should not push hard on renewables or push hard on building transmission, but if we want to reduce the risk of failing to decarbonize, we better start doing something like this. And we think that this kind of repowering strategy can preserve tax bases and employment in these small communities, enable a just transition, create a radical improvement in public health, especially local public health, and it fits what Colin was talking about creating this bipartisan solution that both parties can get benefits out of and feel proud of and support. Next slide. So Kirsty talked earlier about the benefits of de-scoping the nuclear project. So there's even if you take a kind of well-designed advanced reactor project, you by reusing parts of the coal plant, the turbine hall, the turbine, the condensers, the generators, the grid connection, etc., you can get a significant scope reduction and a significant reduction in cost. And if you can standardize and productize the heat source delivery process, you can get even more reductions in cost. And when we've run models for this, we believe that because you're taking away the cost of buying coal and you're taking away the cost of the pollution control process, which are the two largest costs in operating a coal plant, you will be able to operate this coal plant at a lower cost of energy, be able to have a lower LCOE afterwards than before. So this means we'll be creating competitive electricity that lowers the cost of energy for consumers, lowers the health and externality burdens on the public and consumers, and does that in a way that's highly scalable, in time to meet our climate goals. So that's a kind of a cartoon picture of a repowering project where you're turning off the coal boilers and adding a new advanced heat source connected by thermal energy storage. Next slide. So TerraPraxis, our organization, has launched a project this year. We've assembled to develop a highly scalable coal repowering design. So this is a design that would be shared with the members of the organization. So this isn't, this is not a business that we're going into. This is a collective design process. We have utility partners, we have engineering and supply partners, and we expect to have partners from advanced reactor developers. We've assembled a global team of leading experts, and we're really focused on not just the technical problem of how do you design a building that advanced reactors can go in and how do you make it standardized, but how do you make it easy to license by the NRC? How do you make it easy to build? How do you make the feasibility study and the design process that has to happen in order to license or in order to make a final investment decision and so forth? How do you make that process as fast as possible? And to do that, we're actually working with one of the world's leading algorithmic design firms. So we're basically designing an AI system that can design your plant for you. So you'll be able to feed in data about your coal plant and the site and the temperature conditions for the steam turbine and the power market and all of that, and it will generate design alternatives and create a cost, budget, and a schedule, and all of these other useful artifacts that are needed to make both business decisions, regulatory decisions, and to rapidly make repowering decisions for whole fleets of coal plants. So the idea here is that we're going to make the repowering decision-making process, including the regulatory interaction, extremely fast and easy for customers to develop a market for these advanced heat sources in parallel with the demonstration activities that are going on to actually demonstrate the core technology. And we have a $1.4 million project, phase 1 for this year underway currently. Next slide. So the goal is to make a system that can repower 2 terawatts of coal in the last 20 years that we have between 2030 and 2050. And to do that, this has got to be a very attractive investment for all the key stakeholders, for the plant owners, the shareholders, and for people who would like to buy coal plants and convert them. And it's got to be based in a supply chain strategy that enables the kind of pace and scale that we need, which is approximately 100 gigawatts a year. And it cannot be, we cannot expect the licensing authorities to to do this in a fast or convenient way unless we redesign the way we deliver them the information and we optimize it to make their process easy and convenient and make it extremely straightforward for them to verify that the requirements that they have been met. And so we are actually working with licensing authorities in several countries to design this process so that it is streamlined from a licensing perspective. And finally, outputs from this project will be showcased. Initial outputs will be showcased at the Clean Energy Ministerial later in May. And we expect to be doing a fairly major event at the COP meeting in November, showing off our kind of feasibility and screening tool. And our goal is to have every coal plant owner in the world know about this screening tool by the end of the year. Next slide.
Last slide.
Okay.
Good job.
Thank you.
Okay, so that was, for those of you who haven't been thinking about how to repower coal, boy, that was a lot of fun to see, and the creativity associated with, and I think, you know, the preservation of the infrastructure that we have is critically important, especially if you look at what it takes to create steel and cement and those types of things. So
And the critical issue there, I mean, those are all important factors. And I think as we try to build a very large amount of new generation over the next 25 to 30 years, we're going to find out how much the kind of resource implications are for those things. But I think the critical one is really time. It's just difficult to get that much stuff done in that short an amount of time. And if that list of things we have to do includes building transmission, there is no demonstration anywhere in the world except China that you can build a lot of transmission fast.
right. No, I think you know, time waits for no man or woman, right? And I love how you guys are also bringing in and looking at how we build off the success of shipping. I have to admit, I didn't think about shipping as the 5th largest country, but living in California, you know, when you have those kinds of economies of scale, you can make things happen, right? And I think it's a really interesting way to look at how we could be a small new piece in that aspect. We are way over time, but I did not, I was thoroughly enjoying the conversation and your discussion, so I didn't want to interrupt. However, that does, I'm hoping that you guys will agree to help me get these questions answered. We did get quite a bit of questions during your discussion. Maybe we can get together, and for the audience, Holly, if you could bring back up, you know, we're gonna post the answers in the LinkedIn group. You know, I think there were several questions that we didn't get to throughout this webinar. I really thought 2 hours would be plenty, but see, you know, it just gives you an idea of the challenge associated with the magnitude of considering the solutions associated with this. So, Kirsty and Eric, to put you a little bit on the spot, you know, if you'll help me there, we'll post answers to those questions that were sent in. To all the speakers and the attendees that came today, thank you. I realize this is a bit different for us in nuclear, but I do think this is critically important for us to look at how our technologies fit into the broader scope of decarbonization and clean energy. We and the work, Kirsty and Eric, that you were doing to help us understand from from the end, right? What is the cost target, right? Where do you have to be? I think you can innovate to that, and I love the fact that you're bringing that information forward to help the developer community. With that, again, thanks everyone. We will be our next part of this webinar series will come out in June. It will be a little bit of a different format that we're still working on. If you have some ideas of what you would like to see, what you might like to be in a little bit more dialogue on, please feel free to get in touch. gain@inl.gov always works, and let us know how we can help keep this conversation going. Kirsty and Eric, thanks so much. That was fabulous. Everyone else, I hope everybody, again, I'm going to end on Happy Earth Week. And if you aren't doing something on Earth Day, find something to do on Earth Day. That fills up your spirit and keeps you moving in all the work that we're all working towards on clean energy. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks.